Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So this is my final juz reminder for the remainder of Ramadan, and it's my pleasure to be able to share with you some thoughts, particularly concentrating on Surah Al-Hujurat. And I mean, this surah, it's quite a short surah, relatively speaking, within the context of the Quran. But I think that it's so remarkable because, especially today, in the kind of world that we live in, it it captures so well the malaise of Muslims in terms of some of our habits that have become, almost far too normal in the way that we conduct our lives. It's particularly when we consider, for example, social media and the impact that that has had on the way that we understand one another. So, in particular, I want to concentrate on the ayats that start at number 6 and go through to number 13. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us certain reminders about how we conduct our relationships between one another. So, for a start, he's saying, check facts that are brought by troublemakers. Okay, that's point number one. That when a troublemaker, a known troublemaker in particular, brings you a piece of news, be skeptical about it. Don't just trust it immediately. Don't start acting on the basis of that information. And it reminds me that sometimes we see stories within the tabloid press, like the Daily Mail, about Muslims, and we don't take that moment. We don't take that moment to just sit back, take stock, and think, okay, is this coming from a trustworthy source? And especially when we see stories that are embedded by kind of Muslims who are close to these newspapers, we should really be treating their desire to work with these papers with a serious pinch of salt. So I think that's point number one, really, just in terms of a reflection on checking facts when they're brought by troublemakers. The second point that's being raised, really, in relation to kind of the interpersonal space between us, or how the community engages with one another, is that when there are two sets of believers that are fighting against one another, then we have a duty to try and bring their hearts back together. Now, of course, the Quran is specifically talking about the example of fighting here, but of course, we could talk about any kind of animosity that exists between two groups of believing people, and to bring them closer, so that we can try and reduce at least that animosity that exists between them. We think a lot in terms of wrongdoing being about crime and punishment, but healing hearts is even more important than punishing aggressors or oppressors. If we can move them from their position, I think that's quite, especially when they're Muslims, and it's quite an important function that we can play. And the reason I say that is because I was thinking of the example of Ibn Abbas, radiallahu an, that when the Khawarij split from the Sahaba after the death of Prophet ﷺ, he went there and he didn't, go there, with any accusation more than, the simple statement that he makes to say that I don't see any amongst your number who were with the Prophet when the revelation came, right? He still is trying to appeal to their sense of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to bring them back in. These people have been involved with lots of fitna and fasad amongst the Muslims, and yet, he doesn't just outcast them, he doesn't excommunicate them entirely. He still attempts to bring them back in. But of course, saying that, the Quran is very clear that when a group of Muslims are oppressing, then you have to join those who are fighting for justice against that oppression. So if their hearts are not being healed, if you can't appeal to their sense of justice and morality, then you do have to fight them. Then you do have to stop them, even if they're Muslims, in their oppression. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't jeer at one another, don't call each other names. This is a common thing that happens in social media all the time, that people, they get reduced to name calling because they don't want to engage with one another. They just want to get their point across, and if they can't get their point across, they just hurt one another with nasty words. And in so many ways, we replicate the worst excesses of modernity when we do this. This whole idea about it being about yourself, that our presence in the public space is about who we are as individuals, rather than actually us being in the public space being about pedagogy, how we give dawah, how we treat one another, how we exemplify the best characteristics. And of course, like myself, I know I fall short of this, so I'm definitely reminding myself of this as I go through these ayat. Also, this surah says, don't spy on one another. In South London we say stitches, snitches get stitches, right? But outside of that, like, it's important that we think about the fact that we live in a time when it's so easy for people to try and gain privilege and try and gain position, especially in relation to authorities. But there is an Islamic ethic that sits at the heart of not using the community to spy on the community in order to gain that position that you're seeking, because this is about your ethics at the end of the day. That to harm another person just for the sake of your own personal improvement or personal position is something that is sinful, and so it's important that we stay away from that. And the final point I want to make from this surah is one in relation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we split you into tribes and nations that you can recognize one another, but the best of those of you are those of you with taqwa. And that is so crucial. This idea of taqwa, that this idea of God consciousness, of knowing that it's not about where we come from, it's not about our lineage, it's not about our blood, it's not about which part of London we're from even. The only thing that matters at the end of the day is that consciousness that we have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how we relate our daily lives back to Him. So inshallah, I hope those were some useful words and a reminder for myself first and foremost. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses you in all that you do for the remainder of this Ramadan, and that He accepts all of our deeds. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.